Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to do a review of the movie Napoleon. So I was going to talk about something entirely different this week, but after watching the new Napoleon movie I just had to give my unasked for two penn'orths worth on Ridley Scott's latest film. In case you haven't seen it yet, my review does include a few spoilers, but most of these have already been extensively discussed following the release of the trailer. However, given that I'm about to absolutely slate this film, I think a few spoilers are entirely necessary and will just help to soften the blow if you still decide to go and see it in the cinema. At least you'll go into the auditorium with your expectations suitably lowered and be a little bit less disappointed as a result. Now, I don't go to the cinema as often as I would like. These days you have to sell a kidney if you want to be able to afford to go on a regular basis, and there's so much rubbish that seems to hit the big screens these days. And don't get me wrong, I am a big film buff. I really enjoy films. I enjoy being taken on a journey through the silver screen, but I can get a lot of that through my TV, frankly, with the added bonus that I can pause it for this old geezer to have a comfort break. One of the things that mostly puts me off of a lot of modern filmmaking is the completely excessive use of CGI in movies, with each new film trying to outdo the last one. And while Hollywood keeps trying to achieve the previously impossible with CGI, they completely forget that things like story arc and character development are really important to a good film. So when I do go to the cinema, it's usually because I've picked a movie that I think is going to avoid that trap. And when I learned that Ridley Scott was leaning heavily on practical effects, not just exclusively CGI, I was even more interested in seeing this film. So it's fair to say that I, along with many others, was quite excited when pictures of the production started to be released in late 2022. Some of the costumes looked amazing, and it was clear from the photos that there was going to be a heavy emphasis on Napoleon's military campaigns and achievements. And as more and more pictures became available, this impression was just reinforced. We got the film's tagline, "He came from nothing, he conquered everything," leaving little doubt that the military story was the central focus of the movie. At last, a film I wanted to see, I thought to myself. This looks amazing. And then the trailer dropped, and so did my heart. The glaringly obvious historical inaccuracies that leapt out of the trailer were a major warning sign, as was the apparent emphasis on Napoleon's relationship with Josephine. How on earth was Ridley Scott going to fit Napoleon's entire military career into this film and tell the other side of the story in 2.5 hours? But, I'm an optimist, and I was still looking forward to seeing the film. Now, my family will often complain that I like everything that I watch because I can't bring myself to be critical. It's not entirely true, but broadly. And to a certain extent, I have to agree. It is true. I often give mediocre films more latitude and certainly more forgiveness than they probably deserve. I'm not a great critic from that point of view. But anyone who knows me will also know that I'm much more critical of movies which play fast and loose with historical facts. So while I expected to be entertained by this big budget epic, I also went in with a degree of trepidation based on what I'd seen in the trailer. Now that I've seen the film, I'm sad to say I think my trepidation was completely justified. Now, there have already been a lot of really good reviews listing the historical inaccuracies of the film, so I'm not going to repeat them here. Frankly, if I did, this video would be almost as long as the film itself. I think it's fair to say there are a lot of clumsy mistakes, unforced errors and outright inventions in this screenplay. Now, I understand it's often necessary to make some changes when turning history into a workable movie. I can accept the need for compression of timelines and even amalgamation of minor characters to make a story work as a film and to make it understandable to the audience. And I also expect there to be some exposition or invented dialogue designed to inform the audience of what is happening. After all, and this is a sad fact, but most of the audience will, in all likelihood, be very unfamiliar with the actual history. At best, they'll know who Napoleon was, roughly when these events were taking place, and they might know some of the key battles, certainly battles like Waterloo they'll probably know about. And of course Napoleon's story covers decades of political intrigue and military campaigns that shaped Europe for years to come. Not that you could tell that from the film, because none of the characters appear to age and great chunks of Napoleon's career are entirely left out. I mean, that being said, I didn't go into this film expecting to see a documentary. I was prepared for small, logical and to a certain extent necessary inaccuracies in order for the filmmaker to tell the story to an audience and maybe encountering that story for the first time. But there were some truly bizarre diversions from their history that seemed to serve no purpose whatsoever. And even to this relatively uneducated eye, there were some huge whoppers that really distracted from my enjoyment of this movie. And I'm sure students of military history, and particularly students of Bonaparte, can pick out even more from this film. Amazingly, there were actually historical advisors on the film. But frankly, I think most of the deliberate mistakes can be laid firmly at the door of Ridley Scott himself, who made it clear in several interviews that he pretty much disregarded the history books because the authors were not there 200 years ago. Well, I'm afraid that's a level of arrogance and willful disregard of documentary evidence that really gets my goat. And in a movie with a budget of, I think it was $200 million, I expect some attempt at historical accuracy to be reflected in the final cut. I think it's fair to say that as someone with more than a passing interest in military history, I found the relationship of Napoleon and Josephine to be an unnecessary distraction from the supposedly epic narrative of Bonaparte's military exploits. And 2.5 hours, the film was far too short to adequately tell the military story, let alone allow time to crowbar in a love story as well. For me, it felt like I was watching the mash-up of two entirely different scripts about Napoleon's life, either of which could have been turned into an excellent story in their own right, but together they just didn't work. Worse still, when the film does focus on the military aspects of Napoleon's life, it skips so much exposition that even someone like myself, with a passing knowledge of the period, is left scratching their head wondering what the hell is going on. Many commentators have said the same thing, that this film at no point gives any indication of Napoleon's military genius, or even the great social changes that he ushered into French civil life. Battles seem to take place without even a cursory explanation of strategy, leaving the viewer to assume that he was winning because of, I don't know, luck, rather than martial ability. The most generous thing that I can say about this is that this was a missed opportunity. So at the beginning of this video I said I wasn't going to list the movie's historical errors, but I can't do this review without pre-warning you of the absolute travesty that was the Battle of Waterloo. Firstly, it seemed to be filmed in a gloomy vision with a dark filter over everything. And, if you were hoping to see beautiful bright coloured uniforms, prepare to be disappointed, because everything appeared to be grey and dark. Now, I appreciate that at the beginning of the battle, before the battle started, it was raining and it was overcast, but it brightened up later in the day. And at no point did you feel that there was anything more than anything more than a large messy skirmish, let alone a battle the size of Waterloo. I mean, on that fateful day in 1815, the French had 72,000 troops in the field, the British had 68,000, and then the Prussians arrived with a further 45,000. At no point during the battle in this film did you get the impression that this was anywhere near that size, and no effort was made to represent the true scale of the battle. I mean, I know I said I was looking forward to practical effects rather than CGI, but if you don't have access to a cast of tens of thousands of extras like De Laurentiis had for the 1970 version of Waterloo, then you have to use what tools you have. Both armies facing off in this film appeared to consist of a single line of troops in trenches, yes, you heard me correctly, with a single line of cannon about 10 feet behind them, and then the command tents of both generals a few feet behind that. And of course Hollywood had to give Napoleon and Wellington a rousing pre-battle speeches to their men, most of which were extremely laughable. The British also apparently had sniper rifles by strapping telescopes to the top of their rifles. The Prussians appeared from entirely the wrong direction, And just when I thought it couldn't get any more ridiculous, Napoleon led a cavalry charge in a final last-ditch attempt to win the battle. There's loads more I could say, but frankly, I was losing the will to live by that point. I mean, at this point in the review, I'm trying to think of any good points that I can discuss, and frankly, what I have is a stretch. When you could see them, the uniforms were beautiful, and some of the outfits that the other characters were wearing were really, really nice. The scene where Napoleon crowns himself emperor was probably the best visually, I thought, but it was let down by Joaquin Phoenix's weak and croaky voice as he delivered the line that he'd found the crown in the gutter and placed it upon his own head. I have to say that I found Phoenix's performance as Napoleon to be little more than a weird caricature throughout the film. Napoleon was depicted either as bored, petulant or childlike, sometimes all three. And I'm not sure if that was entirely down to Phoenix's performance, because the script was pretty dire. I was going to say in places, but most of the dialogue was pretty dire actually. Phoenix had some truly bizarre one-liners that I think were meant to be funny, but wouldn't have been out of place in a low-budget B-movie, let alone a big movie like this. Vanessa Kirby's performance as Josephine was the one that stood out in the film, and has rightly been applauded by critics. However, as the only character with any sort of story arc, depth or half-decent lines, it's not entirely surprising that her performance stood out in a mediocre field. So, should you go and see this film? Well, if like me you're planning on doing a review for your YouTube channel or your blog, then obviously yes. But if you wanted to be inspired to get the brushes out and start painting Napoleonics, probably not. I mean, that's not to say that the costumes aren't good, many were, but I expect any wargamer with even a passing knowledge of the period will be bleeding from the eyes by the end of this film. Incidentally, there is apparently a 4-hour version that will be out on Apple TV next year. It may be worth waiting for, but it isn't going to remove the excess of historical accuracies that are already in the film. And if anything, it will just give Ridley Scott an opportunity to annoy us even some more. I think if you have an interest in the history of this period, you're not going to enjoy this film, not for one bit. And the mashup of the two stories just made for a really confusing narrative that wasn't even entertaining. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I'm fairly forgiving of most movies, but I was actually bored in parts. And by the end of this film, I was really just not enjoying it at all. And when Napoleon led that cavalry charge at Waterloo, the only thing stopping me from getting up and walking out was the fact that I knew the film was nearly over. I'd already given 2.25 hours of my life away. What was another quarter? My main recommendation would be that if you intend on going, take your non-wargaming partner, because when they turn to you and say, did that actually happen? You can spend the next 3 hours explaining all the things that were wrong with the movie. One final point, which probably best sums up my experience of sitting through this monstrosity. I can't think of another word to describe it. As we walked out of the cinema, my wife turned to me and she said that at one point she glanced in my direction and she thought I looked like I was watching a horror movie. I had my hands in my face, was watching the film from my fingers and muttering, "Dear God," under my breath. This is certainly a movie that I will remember, but not in a good way. So I think it's probably best if I wrap up there. But I want to do what I usually do and ask, have you seen the film yet? Are you planning on seeing it? And if you have seen it, what did you think? I mean, since seeing the film, I've watched a load of other people's videos, read several reviews, and they all seem to broadly agree with my impressions. So at least I'm not alone. But you never know, maybe you saw some redeeming features in this film, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. As always, I'd love to hear what you think. What did you think of my review? Do you think I was being fair? Particularly if you've seen the movie yourself, not just the trailer. Well, that's it for this week. If I've rattled on for quite a bit, so there isn't really time for a hobby update this time. I'll talk about a recent game which I had with the rejects and my preparations for the painting challenge next week. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from this channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming and of course, keep rolling high.